Welcome, my name is Mark Treadwell and this is the 13th or 14th possibly video clip in this series, and in this series we've been looking at the development of our understanding of how the brain learns through to the learning process and then the competencies that underpin this. And in this section we're looking at some of the key external aspects that actually are required to be put in place in order to ensure the validity of the work that's being done and the rigour around what is being done as well. I want to talk about in this video really the role of action learning. And action learning is a critical aspect of being able to, as an educator, reflect on our own practice but also gather data around that practice. So it's not just a matter of thinking, yeah, that seemed to go quite well, or everybody seemed to really enjoy that. What actually is happening? And so once again we talked earlier about the role of the swivel in terms of actually being able to videotape yourself in the privacy of your own home, watching yourself teach, which is terrible. Watching yourself on video is always a terrible thing to have to do, but it does give you a real good insight as to what is actually happening in your classroom. From those processes, from actually watching yourself, what can generally happen out of that is you get inspired to think, I'd like to change a particular aspect of what I do. But we want to make sure that the change in what you do actually has an effect on the teaching and learning that takes place in that classroom. And when I talk about teaching and learning, I'm talking about the educator-learner and I'm talking about the learner-educator. So both parties are both involved in teaching as an educator and also learning. So it's an educator-learner relationship between everybody in the space. Too often in education, huge amounts of money have been spent in programs that have been merely fashion trends. There was no critique and there was no process whereby what changes were being proposed were trialled to see did they actually make a difference. And I'm very, very keen in this process here to make sure that we look and see, do these changes actually make a difference for the learner and also for the educator, and for the learner-educator and the educator-learner. Does it make a difference? Because if it doesn't make a difference, then we shouldn't be doing it. Right? So if you carry out this process and find, oh my goodness, nothing changed, there was no real improvement, then don't do it. Okay? It's very important. Don't do this because you think, oh, it's a jolly good idea. Do it because it makes a difference. The process you go through in the action learning process is very, very similar to the learning process itself. It's just a different context. So instead of the competencies being sitting at the centre of this process, we really have a modification to that, and in that modification you've got an external reference person. Now that can be one of your peers in the classroom, in the school, or the organisation you're involved in. It could be someone external, and we really do, if you can possibly actually manage it, encourage people to have an external person, because they bring a totally different set of eyes to viewing the situation that you actually are involved in. And they see things differently. Teachers see things through the teacher frame, educators see things through the educator frame. External people who are not necessarily involved directly in education actually can see things quite differently. So that's really, really powerful. And they also act as your critical friend. They're the ones that have the hard conversation saying, you know what, actually, you completely ignored half the class, if that's not obvious to you already by your video. So that's there. Thinking and questioning, which is one of the competencies we talked about earlier, is critical. We need to ask rich, open, fertile, harder thinking questions, Socratic questions of ourselves, of our own practice, of what's happening in our classrooms. And we need to be willing to go, oh my goodness, I need to make some changes. We need to be a learner. Okay, so the whole notion of educator-learner has to really become an element that's actually true to our nature as educators. Collaboration, also one of our previous competencies, is absolutely critical as well. Collaborating, wandering in and out of each other's spaces, critiquing each other, working in a positive environment to actually improve what we do and make what we do more effective and more efficient. And finally, the fourth competency really within here is connecting and reflecting. Reflecting on our own practice, watching what we're seeing from the video clips we're taking, listening to the people who are making commentary to us, and distilling and synthesizing, but connecting our ideas. How do I connect that idea if we're going to look at flipping the classroom, for example? Does that actually work? Does that make a difference? What elements can I bring into that, and what elements do I need necessarily to add to that possibly and augment that with? What do I need to change in my room? Is there a need for a teacher desk at the front of the room? Is there a need for a front of a room full stop? So those are our new competencies essentially. Okay, and the other thing about action learning is it's an iterative process. We may make some changes, and then we may make changes to the changes. So the following process you can see in the diagram, and what we're seeing here is that we're using a prompt that causes us to reflect on our own teaching and learning. We might listen to a video clip, we might see another person's practice, we may get some comments back from students, we may learners, we may get comments back from parents, caregivers. Something prompts us to go, I need to make some changes. Okay, and it's the same as in the learning process. That prompt causes us to be curious. It's an emotive thing. We feel things. When people tell us things about our practice, we feel things, an emotion. And that emotion causes us to be curious. And hopefully also it inspires us. We need to see beyond the fact that we've got to make some changes and realise that we want to be the best we can. And what that leads to is our first sort of section here is to do some research. Does the brain really learn like this? Do we know that for sure? What difference does that make? What differences could that make? Where's the background reading? Okay, and there's lots of reading and going and seeing other schools, wherever you possibly can. Visit schools who are already practicing some of the notions you're thinking of adopting. Because it's when you see it and you see the change in what's happening to what you're doing presently, then we're motivated. That inspiration occurs at that point. That causes us to do some research. And then we apply it to our own context. Never ever take someone's program from somewhere else and adapt it 100% as it is to your program. It never works. You always have to contextualize what you're doing. And so eventually you come up with a suggested modification, and then you might select a trial group, and that might be a trial group of students, learners in your classroom. It might also be half the class. Okay, if you're a small school, then it's hard to compare one class with another class, because we need a control group on this side. Okay, we're going to make some changes here, but we need to keep this group the same, and then look at the data to tell us which group of students, educators, learners were more engaged, which were less engaged, which were more interested, who asked more questions, how motivated were they to actually take some agency over their learning, how much time did they personally spend on this, how many times did they sit down and talk about this with you and with their peers. So we need a selection of a trial group and a control group. Then we need to actually do some planning. How are we going to implement this? What changes in my room might actually assist in this? Don't make too many changes at once, because what we want to do is we want to try and actually modify things one thing at a time so we know what actually made the difference. Planning, then we need to design the change in pedagogy, and then we need to implement that trial. And after we implement that trial, we need to collect data, and then we need to assess that data to see, was the change in pedagogy, the change in practice, was it actually beneficial? Did it actually make a difference? So in practice, action learning is a constantly iterating process. And we may find ourselves testing the same thing again and again and making slight modifications to it just to see what actually makes a difference. So action learning, it's a fundamental part of being an educator. So good luck with that. Thank you very much. You can go away and read this section in the book, and then later on you can go and watch the next video. Thank you.